Let's now investigate the relationship between external financing and growth of a company. So the EFN, let me just rewrite it here. So the EFN is equal to delta assets minus delta automatic or spontaneous liabilities minus delta retained earnings. What I want to do now is to make an assumption that we have no automatic liabilities. In other words, we cannot rely on our suppliers, we cannot get the credit from them automatically, so we can only rely on our retained earnings. That's just for simplicity. So assume we have no automatic liabilities. Now, you have to understand, it does not mean that we do not have accounts payable. We may still have accounts payable, we may still have credit from supplier, but that credit is not automatic. So we still need to plan for it. So we need to include accounts payable in our overall estimate of external financing need. Okay? So if none of the liabilities are automatic, then your EFN is going to be equal to simply delta assets minus delta retained earnings. Okay? Now, it may not be obvious to you, but if you think about it intuitively, the bigger the sales growth, the bigger will be the gap between projected change in assets and change in retained earnings. So what's going to happen is when the firm is growing relatively slow, so at low sales growth, EFN will be low. And sometimes it could be equal to 0 or even negative. We will consider example in a moment where EFN is actually negative. You will understand why. But at higher growth, at high sales growth, EFN will be high. And then we will see what happens at different growth rate. You will see that there will be two thresholds. One is called internal growth rate, another is called sustainable growth rate. But for now, I simply want to demonstrate to you that in general, the faster the growth rate in sales, the bigger the EFN is. And it makes sense. Think about it. Even if you look at Apple, the company that makes tremendous amount of money, okay? Their retained earnings, their addition to retained earnings is so huge that they could actually finance substantial growth rate. But even for them, if you ask them to double their sales, they will not be able to do it without additional borrowing. Okay? If you ask them to triple their sales, there is no way they can achieve it with their retained earnings. They will have to borrow. Well, if they want to increase their sales only by 5, 10, 20%, maybe they're okay. They will just use their retained earnings. They don't need to worry about external funding. But once the growth rate becomes very large, the external financing need will automatically increase by a lot. And the reason for it is because asset growth will exceed the growth in retained earnings. Okay? And again, it makes perfect sense. However, let's show that it's the case using an example. So basically, this slide tells you what I already told you, that at low growth, internal financing may be enough. And in fact, your retained earnings may even exceed the required investment in assets, so you will have negative AFN. As the growth rate increases, the internal funding will not be enough, and that's where you start actually needing that EFN. So what we are going to do now, we are going to examine the relationship between growth and external funding. Okay? To do that, we are going to utilize this very simple example. So you have a company, it's called Hoffman Company. So you have income statement that has only sales, costs, and taxes, no interest, no depreciation. And then you have the balance sheet, okay? So the balance sheet, again, is very simple. You have current assets, you have fixed assets, and in terms of right-hand side, you have only debt and owner's equity. You don't even have the split between long-term and short-term. It doesn't really matter, okay? So what I want to note here before we get to our calculation. So for our example, let me write it down. Hoffman Company. Our target debt to equity ratio is equal to 1. Okay? So why is that? Again, if you look at their balance sheet, you will see that their total debt is equal to 250 and their total equity is also equal to 250, which makes debt to equity ratio exactly equal to 1. Now, we will assume that the company wants it that way. The company wants to maintain that same debt to equity ratio regardless of what is going on. In other words, it's not even that it wants to maintain it, but it doesn't want to exceed it. So it's okay to reduce it to less than 1 value, but the company does not want to have debt to equity ratio being higher than 1. And the reasons for that could be various. Some companies like to have that ratio equal to 1. Some may like it to be equal to 2. Some might prefer it to be equal to 0.5. It's purely individual decision of the firm. But empirically, we know, again, it's empirical fact, that once companies achieve certain debt to equity ratio, they do it on purpose. They optimize its capital structure. We will talk about it later in the course. The capital structure decision is about the composition of balance sheet, the split between debt and equity. And according to capital structure theory, there are cons and pros of using debt versus equity. And for every company, there is some optimal point of debt versus equity, the optimal ratio of debt to equity that the company wants to maintain. Okay? So for now, don't worry about how to calculate that optimal point. Let's just assume that that particular firm, Hoffman Company, wants it to be no more than 1. It's their decision, it's their optimal point. Okay? So it will be important in a moment. You will see why it's important to, note to yourself that debt to equity ratio should not exceed 1. With that in mind, and given these data here, let's look at what's going on with Hoffman Company on the various projected sales growth scenarios. So let's start with zero growth. So what does it mean? It means that your sales are not growing. Okay? So let me again remind you how to calculate the FN. So you know that it's delta assets minus delta retained earnings. But now let me just remind you that it's assets over sales times delta sales. Okay? Minus delta retained earnings. Okay? I could rewrite delta retained earnings as profit margin times projected sales times 1 minus D, but for now it's not necessary. I could just keep it as delta retained earnings. So now if you look at that formula, if your delta sales is equal to 0, then my delta assets, okay, are going to be equal to 0. And that makes sense. Think about it logically. If I'm not growing, if my sales are not changing, okay, I don't need any assets. I don't need to make investments in any assets so I can continue the way I am. There is no point to increase capacity. There is no point to invest in inventories. There is no point to invest in accounts receivable or cash holdings. So my delta assets is going to be 0. So if growth rate G is equal to 0, my delta assets is going to be equal to 0. My delta retained earnings is still going to be the same as before. Because remember, even though I'm not growing my sales, I'm still making money. I just maintain the same level of sales, so it's the same level of income as before, and as a result, the same level of addition to retained earnings. So my delta retained earnings is going to stay the same. Because again, let me just look here. So let's see here. Here's my income statement. Here's my addition to retained earnings. So again, if I don't change my sales, my retained earnings will still go up by 44. So what happens is my delta retained earnings are equal to 44. So under this scenario, my EFN is equal to 0 minus 44 equals to minus 44. So what does it really mean? It means that not only you do not have deficit, you have a surplus. It means that you have more money than you need. So how does it work then? How can we put it all together in the balance sheet? So let's think about it. So we don't need this stuff here. So, okay, so my assets don't change. My equity increases by 44. Okay, so I have to add retained earnings to my equity. So now my balance sheet does not balance. And again, think about it logically. Forget about just accounting. Think about it more intuitively. If I'm adding to my retained earnings, but I do not invest that money anywhere in my assets, what should I do? The only way to make sense out of it is if I reduce my debt. So I have minus 44 here. So what happens is I generate some profits, but I have nowhere to put it because I do not grow. I do not grow, and as a result, I don't need to hoard my assets. Remember, companies invest in assets only to grow. If they don't grow, they don't need assets. So if I generate my retained earnings, I add $44 to my retained earnings. The only way to make my balance sheet balance is if I reduce my debt. So what happens is your equity rises, your debt goes down. So your new debt to equity ratio, okay, is going to be 250 minus 44, which is 206, divided by 294. Okay, so your new debt to equity ratio is going to be less than 1. All right, so how much less? That's what the table shows you. So let's just now go through this first row. So increase in required assets is equal to 0. We just established that. Addition to retained earnings is still 44. Your EFN is negative. And now I demonstrated to you that your debt will go down, your equity will increase. So your debt to equity ratio turns out to be 0.7, all right, 70%, 0.7. Okay? All right, so that's kind of a baseline. And again, it makes sense. Imagine a firm that has no growth, but still generates income. Why would that firm make any investment in assets? The first thing the firm is going to do is just try to get rid of debt. Why would you have any debt if you don't need it? Okay? So the next one would be 5% growth. I'm not going to repeat it, but you could use the formula that I just used to calculate that if your sales growth is 5%, your delta assets is going to be 25. Your addition to retained earnings is going to be 46.2, but still your EFN is going to be negative, which means that the growth rate in sales is low, right? It's still so low that you generate still more money than you need. So you still pay off some of your debt. So on the 5% growth, you still have more money than you need. So your debt to equity ratio will still be lower than 1. And so on. At 10%, your asset requirement is 50, but your addition to retained earnings is 48.4. So finally, you have some positive EFN. Okay, but your projected debt to equity ratio is still less than 1, and the reason for it is because you added to equity more than you added to debt. Okay, so think about it. If I increase my equity by 48.4, but my EFN is contributing to my debt, so my debt goes up by 1.6. So obviously, my denominator, my equity, will increase by a lot more than my numerator, my debt. Therefore, my projected debt to equity ratio is still less than 1. Okay? And so on. So, at this point, I want to ask you to pay attention to first important benchmark. Okay? So, as you can see, at 0% growth, my EFN is negative. At 5% growth, my EFN is still negative, but at 10%, it turns into positive. So somewhere between 5 and 10% growth, you become just enough self-sufficient. So somewhere maybe at 9.5, 9.8% growth rate, your EFN turns to 0. So when your EFN is equal to 0, it means, so EFN equal to 0, it means that your delta assets are exactly equal to your delta retained earnings. So what does it imply? How do we interpret it? We mean that when EFN is equal to 0, you generate just enough retained earnings to satisfy your projected asset growth. Okay? That is called internal growth rate. So again, internal growth rate is the growth rate that tells you how much the firm can grow, all right? How much the firm can grow using only retained earnings and nothing else. So you use retained earnings as your only source of financing. So think about it this way. Let's say you're running a small company. It's not publicly traded, it's not well known. You cannot borrow from financial markets. Banks don't know you really well, and they give you exuberant interest rate. You don't want to borrow from the bank either because it's extremely expensive. The only thing you can rely on is your own income. So you could think of some really tiny small restaurant, okay? And that restaurant does not want to borrow from the bank. The restaurant cannot issue any publicly traded securities. The only thing they can do is just to make money and reinvest that money into their business. So if you ask that restaurant a question, how fast you can grow, or in other words, what is the maximum growth rate you can achieve in your sales, what your sales growth that you can achieve by using only your internally generated funds, that would be your internal growth rate. Okay, so the internal growth rate, again, is the growth rate, the maximum possible growth rate that the company can achieve if it uses only internally generated funds and nothing else, only retained earnings. It turns out that it can be calculated as ROA times retention ratio B divided by 1 minus ROA times B. So this formula could be derived, but I don't need to do that. I mean, I don't think it's a good use of our time. So you can just trust the formula. So in case of our Hoffman company, your ROA is 13.2%. Your retention ratio is roughly 0.67. So your internal growth rate is 9.65. So again, how do you interpret that ratio? I could write it maybe here. I could say that Hoffman can grow its sales up to 9.65% by using internally generated funds only. Okay, so that's a very important parameter. A lot of companies want to know what is that maximum growth rate they can achieve by using internally generated funds only. All right. Now, the next question is, well, in reality, and again, that's where it becomes important to remember that our target growth rate. Okay, so let me show it to you here. Remember, I told you that our target growth rate, our target debt to equity ratio is equal to 1. The company does not mind to maintain that debt to equity ratio. So, in fact, the company wants to maintain that debt to equity ratio. So what's going to happen now? If you look at internally generated money only, you will see that your projected debt to equity ratio is still going to be way less than 1. For example, at 10% growth rate, which is very close to our internally generated, internal growth rate, your debt to equity ratio is less than 1. So what does it mean? It means that the company may be willing to grow faster than that as long as your debt to equity ratio does not exceed 1. So what happens is not only the company will use retained earnings, but also it will supplement retained earnings with additional debt. But the proportion of additional equity that is coming from retained earnings and additional debt would be such that debt to equity ratio stays at level equal to 1. Okay, so again, let's see what happens. Let me just see something here. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to close it for a second so that I discard all of these writings here, because my Apple Pen doesn't work as an eraser here. Okay, so now I can go back to the slides. So let me just demonstrate to you what's going on. So let's just work with 10% growth rate, which is very close to our 9.8 internal growth rate. So as you can see, under that growth rate, my retained earnings increased by 48.4, but my external financing increases by 1.6. So what's going to happen? I will have my equity going up by, I already forgot, 48.4. And my debt will increase by 1.6 only. So that's going to be 251.6. And that would be equal to 298.4. So now see what happens. If I take that 251.6 and I divide by 298.4, I will get this number here, 0.84. But the company is okay with having debt to equity ratio equal to 1. So what does it mean? It means that the company would be willing to add more debt. So in other words, there is no reason to restrict ourselves to only internally generated funds. As long as I supplement my internally generated funds with enough debt such that I maintain the same debt to equity ratio as my original target, I will be okay. Okay? So again, you have to understand that once you have that desired leverage ratio, desired debt to equity ratio, you have the opportunity to use not only internal funds but also additional debt, as long as you don't violate your original debt to equity ratio. Okay? So for example, if you grow at 15%, you're still fine. Your projected debt to equity ratio is only 0.91. You could grow even at 20% and still your debt to equity ratio is 0.98. Now, 25% is not going to work because now your debt to equity ratio goes beyond 1. So it's 1.05. So somewhere between 20 and 25% growth rate in sales, you will achieve that maximum possible growth rate such that you use both internal funds and external borrowing, such that your debt to equity ratio stays at your original level, in this case equal to 1. And that's what we call sustainable growth rate. Okay? So sustainable growth rate is the maximum growth rate that you can achieve by using both internally generated funds and additional debt such that we maintain constant debt to equity ratio. Okay? And it turns out that it's equal to ROE times B divided by 1 minus ROE times B. And in our case, it's equal to 21.4%. Okay? So how do I interpret that number now? So I could say that Hoffman can grow its sales up to 21.4% by using both internal and external funds. That's the key. Not just internal, but internal and external funds, so that its debt to equity ratio is constant at its target level equal to 1. Okay? Now, again, that target level does not have to be 1. For different companies, it could be different, but if we assume that, Hoffman has target ratio equal to 1, the maximum growth rate they can achieve, such that they use both internal and external funds, is 21.4. See how much bigger that growth rate compared to internal. So internal growth rate was what, 9.65. Sustainable growth rate is, more than twice as high, 21.4. Now, this sustainable growth rate is a fundamental metric that is used in a lot of valuation models. So whenever financial analysts are trying to forecast potential growth rate of a company, what can the company achieve? They're focusing on sustainable growth rate. They don't focus on internal. Internal growth rate applies to very small companies. Most major players in the market, publicly traded firms, they use sustainable growth rate because they all borrow money. Again, look at Tesla, they issue debt. Look at General Motors, they issue debt. Samsung, Hyundai, those companies, they issue debt all the time. And there is nothing wrong with that. If you generate money, if you generate your retained earnings, why don't you supplement it with additional debt? As long as you don't change the overall leverage ratio, you are perfectly fine. Okay? So now, the last thing we're going to do is to realize that your sustainable growth rate, that is equal to ROE times B divided by 1 minus ROE times B. Now we know that ROE is equal to profit margin times asset turnover times 1 plus debt to equity ratio, and then times B. Okay, so this first formula, profit margin times asset turnover times 1 plus debt to equity ratio, that comes from our previous factorization of DuPont. Okay, so that's your factorization of ROE. And then you have 1 minus ROE times B. So whatever increases numerator will automatically decrease denominator, so we don't need to worry about denominator. All we need to do is just to see what factors will drive sustainable growth rate. And the answer is now very clear. It's profit margin, because it's right here. It's asset turnover, right here. It's your target debt to equity ratio. Remember, in our previous example, we assumed that your tolerated leverage ratio is equal to 1, but it doesn't mean that some other company would tolerate even higher debt to equity ratio, let's say equal to 2. As a result, it will be growing even faster because it's willing to take that extra leverage. And finally, your B, which is your dividend policy. The more dividends you pay, the lower B is going to be. The less dividends you pay, the more your B is going to be, and as a result, the faster you can grow. Because B basically means that you will be able to retain more money and as a result get more of those automatic sources of funds. So finally, let me just wrap it up with some caveats. Obviously, this is just a model. Okay, so the financial planning models do not indicate which financial policies are the best. Okay, so they don't tell you, do you want more leverage or less leverage? They just tell you, given your leverage preference, here's the growth rate you can achieve. But the question is it smart to target much higher debt to equity ratio, or maybe it's smart to be more conservative? This particular model doesn't tell you that. But that's why you have another model, which is basically your capital structure model. Also, as you heard in this lecture, we made a lot of simplifying assumptions. We assume that everything is related to sales. We assume that there is no interest expense, that there is no depreciation. Okay? We assume that your costs are always proportional to sales because there are no economies of scale. That's usually the nature of any model. Any model, to make it tractable, usable, and simple, requires simplifying assumptions. Nothing prevents you from relaxing those assumptions. For example, if you believe that you have depreciation expense, all you have to do is just to forecast it directly. Once you do that, you can incorporate it in your model. Similarly, if you believe that there will be interest expense, you can always put it in your model and incorporate it. Okay? Also, we believe that our sales forecasts are accurate. What if they are not? All right, the world can change in unexpected ways, so your sales forecast might be absolutely wrong. So what you're going to do, you're going to introduce some uncertainty in your model. So there are some models that actually allow you to look at different scenarios. You look at probability distribution of your sales forecast, and then you calculate your expected values. You calculate your confidence interval, you look at the potential dispersion of your sales forecast, and then you do your modeling. Okay? So the point is, there are many ways to make your analysis deeper, more complicated, and perhaps more realistic. But for this course, I just want you to understand the basics. I want to make sure that you understand the main intuition, the bones of the model. Then you can always grow meat. Then you can always make it more sophisticated if you desire to do so. Okay, so the main thing is just to understand the skeleton. So without any kind of plan, without any model, even the simplest model, you will be really misguided. Okay, so it's better to have some model than no model at all. And this percentage of sales approach is a very good basic model for financial planning and understanding the external financing and the association between the growth rate and your leverage and the availability of your internal funds versus external funds and other things. So you do need that model to plan in order to be able to survive financially.